So on this front slide, I've got some old seed catalogs. I always like the pictures, especially covers on the old seed catalogs. They really were very nice looking. Nothing against photographs, but I think there's something to be said for the old artwork on these. So I always like those. So you'll see those pop up throughout different presentations I do in a number of different places. All right, let me move this down. There we go. So I'll just mention, if I mention a brand name or a trade name of a product, that's not an endorsement by myself nor the university. And certainly if I don't mention a similar product, that's not in any way meant negative. And I'll also say, I don't think we'll cover much on the pesticide world in this topic, but if we were to, nothing I say trumps the label. The label is the law. So always read and follow all label directions when it comes to any sort of pesticide product. So you may notice the name of this class, and I wanted specifically to encourage you to save seed in your garden. So I think it was last year I'd done this class, and afterwards, one of the participants followed up with me, and we were having a good conversation. She was asking great questions. And then we got sort of towards the end, and she more or less said, and just kind of sum it up, it's like, well, I just hope I don't screw it up. It's like, oh, okay, I messed up there, because we are going to cover a lot of technical information. We'll talk about some things that really we're pulling out of the seed certification world as far as purity, but I don't want you to think that's where you have to start at. So it can be a much more relaxed process. You can have fun with it. And so to that end, you know, to me, one of the great things about seed saving is it does have a fun aspect to it. So how many people are familiar with balsam or touch me nots, or there's some other common names? It's an older flower. You're probably not going to find it in many garden centers now, but you can find seed for it. Some of the flowers, this is not a double flower. Some of them are double. So sometimes they'll be called like rose impatiens because they are related to impatiens. The neat thing about them is the seed capsule you see there, whenever they start to dry out, they actually will spring open and fling the seeds out. So that's why they're called touch me nots, because whenever they're getting close to that stage, if you go up and touch the seed capsule, it explodes. Well, you can imagine the fun you can have if you're a kid. And so, you know, to me, if you're going to be doing seed saving and you're going to be having flowers in your garden, this is one to have if you've got kids involved, or maybe if you're a big kid at heart yourself, because it is actually interactive. So, you know, do have fun with this. And tonight we are going to focus mainly on vegetables, just because typically that's the questions I get related to seed saving, but certainly we can save seed from our flowers. And again, you know, we can have fun with it. The other thing is, you know, when we start talking about, you know, maintaining purity on things, the cucurbit family is a great one to talk about, because there's basically three main species that we grow. So we've got Cucurbita pepo, which is everything from acorn to zucchini to the yellow squashes, etc. You can see them all listed there. You've got Cucuminus malo, which is actually cantaloupes. And then you got the Cucuminus sativa. Don't remember what that one is, sorry. But basically those different species will actually not cross with each other. So you don't have to worry about your cantaloupe seed you save tasting like a gourd, because they're not going to cross. But all the Cucurbita pepos that are listed there can actually cross, and it's not going to hurt this year's fruit. And so this is a good segue into this. The seeds have the recombinant genetics from the pollen and then from the ovule. And we'll talk more about it in a minute, but basically it's mom and dad. The fruit itself is basically mom. If you ever looked on cucurbits, they have separate male and female flowers. You can actually know the difference because the female flowers will have the little fruit on it already. So it looks like a little squash or a little cucumber. That's the female flower. The part we eat is actually the female tissue. So even if you were to have a yellow squash that gets pollinated by a gourd, that yellow squash is going to cook up fine. You're never going to know the difference. It's only the seed that is going to be different genetically. And you're going to know that next year. So it's a big deal next year if you're saving seeds and your yellow squash tastes like a gourd. You're probably not going to be happy with that. In the season, no problem. You can grow everything you want to together. As long as you're not saving seed, no worries. At the same time, it is sometimes fun to see what you end up when you're growing like different gourds together, because they will cross with each other. The same thing happens pretty regularly in the flower world with echinacea, cone flowers. If you have different cone flowers planted around your garden, you're very likely going to get cross-pollination. And after a few years, you may suddenly see some cone flowers pop up with some really weird looking blossoms. The petals may be very stringy. It can have petals coming out where normally we have the seed. It's real weird looking things. It just because it's a very outcrossing flower. And so you'll get a seed that ends up getting pollinated and it ends up growing, because cone flowers can spread on us. That's a good thing probably. But, have fun with that. Some people, that's what they enjoy. They like seeing what's going to come out of the seed they saved. Other people, not so much. So, you don't have to take it as serious as some of the presentation is going to take it. So we are going to talk about what seeds we can save or should save ideally. We'll talk about very briefly how to properly grow our plants in order to have good seed to save, a little bit about processing some seeds for saving from some of the easier ones to start with. And then we'll also mention storage of seeds. And again, focusing on vegetables, but the basic essential principles that we're covering will be applied to perennial crops or biennials, and certainly ornamentals and even others. So successful seed production basically needs a happy, healthy plant. We want to avoid any sort of diseased plants if possible, and the best way to do that is have healthy plants. So having sufficient fertility there in our gardens where we're growing them, maybe incorporating a soil test if we've never done that before, but certainly making sure the plant has what it needs. Most of the time in our region of Northeast Tennessee, sometime during the season, there's going to be a period where it's beneficial to have some irrigation. And so if we have that available to us, that's good, particularly since when we talk about seed production, we are raising these fruit that we're going to harvest longer than ordinary. And we'll talk about that. But certainly if we are doing irrigation, not doing it in a way that wets the plant or the leaves itself, because leaf wetness is highly conducive to disease. So anytime we can keep a plant drier, the better, but certainly if it needs water, we do want to make that available if we can. We want to make sure we're timing our plantings correctly. Past, several days, we certainly had some beautiful weather. Today is maybe a little bit more of a reality check that no, it's not summer yet. So no 70 degrees for us today. But, in our area, our warm season crops, we really don't want to be putting out before May 1st at the earliest. And that's still looking at that 10-day, 14-day forecast, making sure we're not going to have a late frost happen, because we can have a frost occur after May 1st. It does happen sometimes. Sometimes our last frost may be in early April at some point. So sometimes we can get away with it, but it's more than just can we avoid frost. It's about soil temperature. It's about overnight temperatures, which typically still drop quite a bit. And our warm season plants aren't going to be the happiest with cold soil and cold overnight temperatures. So by and large, we don't gain a lot whenever we really push that envelope to get things out early. And so because of that, I encourage folks to wait until timing is correct for the crop. By the same thing, cool season, let's plant them in the cool season. Don't try to push that envelope. We do want to look at rotating the location of crops and crops families so that we can avoid building up diseases or insects in that given area. Also, related plants are going to use nutrients that are similar to each other, so we can sort of overuse or maybe exhaust certain nutrients if we just plant the same plants over and over and over in a given area. So being able to rotate around within the garden or even between different beds if we have the space is a good ideal. I want to encourage you to have judicious use of pesticides. So whether we're talking about insecticides or fungicides for controlling disease, having healthy plants may incorporate the use of pesticides, whether conventional or organic. And using those as needed. And of course, as label directions indicate, is one part of making sure our plants are taken care of. And lastly, there are some seed treatments we can do to kill pathogens. It won't kill every pathogen, but there are some things like hot water treatments that can be done that can sometimes give us a little bit of insurance if maybe we're afraid we did have some disease infested plants that we were harvesting from. But again, it's not all diseases that those will take care of. So again, we could spend all night on just this slide talking about the different components, but just sort of just keep it in the back of your mind. We do want as healthy a plants as possible that we are saving from. The other thing real quickly is just some basic botany. So where are these seeds coming from? It is a result of sexual reproduction of plants. And so what we are literally talking about is pollen being moved from the anther to the stigma. A pollen tube then grows down and it then fertilizes the ovules that are in the ovary. And so that's how we get plants from seed, or seed from plants. This happens in more than one form or fashion. This would be a perfect flower where we have both male and female on the same flower. I already mentioned earlier, cucurbit crops are going to have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. We look across the world of horticulture. Certainly we know there are male and female trees on some things. So how this exactly is accomplished does vary, but the basics are still there. It's the transfer of pollen to the pistil. There are some plants that do not have to have that. So we have some modern varieties that actually don't require pollination. They'll actually start setting fruit on their own. There's some cucumbers, for instance. It's called parthenogenesis. So especially in greenhouses, where sometimes we can have difficulty having a environment suitable for insect pollinators, which would normally be our cucurbit pollinators in the case of cucumbers. There are some that will naturally set fruit on their own. So just be aware of that. But again, the rule is pollen to stigma to get that seed. So when it comes to genetics, and I'm certainly not the guy to be explaining genetics in depth, but there's just a little bit that I think helps us understand what we're seeing out there in the garden. You may sometimes run across these words. Phenotype. Phenotype is basically what you are seeing. It's what's obvious. It's what is evident. Genotype, that's basically just saying the genes that are contained. We're not always going to see all the genes that are there because we have recessive traits that can be masked by others. And certainly the other thing we need to understand is the environment. So in the environment, even though it is variable, well, and because it's variable, we can have different effects. So sometimes we may save seed from a plant that we thought, okay, this is going to be a dwarf plant. And so when we plant it out, it's not the least bit dwarf. That could be because what we were seeing as dwarfing wasn't a genetic characteristic, it was an environmental effect for some reason. So not everything we can see happening in the garden gets passed on. So just be aware of that. So it's not always easy to know or predict what's going to happen with seeds sometimes, particularly if we're dealing with things that have a lot of variability to them. But just understand it's not only what the seed brings to the table, there is the environmental factors that come into play that can change the outcome or what we see. One of the big things to understand if we save seed is horticultural versus true fruit maturity. So horticultural maturity is just when we're referring to how we grow things for the market or for culinary use or how we would primarily use the product. So I don't think it takes me to explain that the cucumbers on the left are what we would like to have at the dinner table, not the one on the right. But if we're saving seed, it's the one on the right that we're actually interested in. The one on the left is going to have immature seed. They're not going to be ready for planting. So we have to let it stay on the plant and let it mature on the plant until we have physiological maturity. And so that's true maturity or seed maturity. And it does typically take longer than we harvest for in the garden. Yes.
For cantaloupe, say you have cantaloupe from the store and you save a seed, would those be good to plant, or would you want to have one that develops on the vine like that?
Well, we would want, so you can save seed from things you buy at the farmer's market or at the grocery store that may not be absolutely physiological, mature. But what you'll find typically is you don't have great germination. And depending on what we're talking about, some things the seed mature earlier than others. But by and large, we are looking for what we would consider something to be overripe that we're saving seed from when it comes to vegetables. So that's a good question. One thing to keep in mind, and this especially comes into play when we talk about saving seeds, like from something we purchase at the grocery store, what type of seed is it? And so some of the language we run across when we start looking at seeds and seed saving, you will hear open pollinated. Sometimes that's used interchangeably with heirloom. They're not really the same because essentially heirloom doesn't have a great definition. Heirloom is intended to be, well, older seeds or seeds that have been, around for a while, or varieties that have been around for a while. But there's really no set definition. So heirloom just means what you want it to mean. So it's kind of one of those words that it's nice, but it doesn't tell us a lot when we really dig down to it. Open pollinated, however, is very specific. And so open pollinated are the type of seeds we should save. And basically what open pollinated means is that we are not producing those seeds under controlled pollination. It's just open to happen. The other option that we see in the marketplace is hybrid seeds. Sometimes these will be denoted by F1. That's just saying that first generation of the cross of the hybrid. So hybrid seeds have two parental lines. And so we do need to understand the distinction here. So open pollinated, we don't have controlled pollination. In some ways, we can kind of think of these as inbred, and I don't want you to think of that as a negative connotation there, because it's really not. It's just that they don't have as broad, typically, of a genetic background as ones that are not open pollinated. So that they have limited, to a certain extent, genetic background. When they are self-pollinated, some things we have self-pollination of, or if they're pollinated by a plant of that same variety, then the offspring or those seeds are going to result in something that looks like the parents. And so that's why we save open pollinated seeds, is because if we don't have outcrossing, if we don't have a different cultivar pollinating them, the seed we save is going to look like what we planted. And so it's predictable, it's reliable. You'll hear this referred to as true to type. And again, don't think of the inbred in this instance as being a negative thing. It's just it has a more narrow genetic base than some others. Hybrids, on the other hand, it is controlled pollination. So basically, we have two parental lines. Think of it as mom and dad. And so they both are bringing very specific characteristics to the table. And so when we cross those, what we get is an offspring that's an F1. And it has a varied genetic makeup because mom and dad had two different genetic makeups. And so because of that, anything that happens to that F1 generation, so if it self-pollinates or if it cross-pollinates with another flower from the same F1 generation, that subsequent F2 generation that grows from that seed has a varied genetic makeup. So that means it could look like mom, it could look like dad, it could look like neither, it could look like what we planted. And it's that variability that is problematic for us, because if you plant 10 tomatoes in your garden, you would like for them to be that red slicer that you planted the prior year, and you'd like to repeat that. If they come up and look very different, maybe some don't have the red slicer look to them. Maybe it's a different shape. Maybe the flavor's not there. Maybe it's lost the disease resistance that you wanted out of it. It's that variable genetic background that makes these unpredictable. And so that's why we don't save seed from hybrids. There are actually amateur breeders or growers that do work at unhybridizing hybrids. And so they will actually take that F1 generation, cross it, grow out those seeds, and then try to keep selecting until they get that open pollinated line that reliably produces the product. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. But there are folks that do work towards that, both as a hobby or as semi-professionally. So Again, that's why we don't save hybrids. Sometimes people say, well, you can't save hybrids. How many people have ever had, a tomato that grew up from a compost pile or whatever, and you bought, and it could have been one that was bought from a store or whatever. You don't know what that was. And sometimes you can have great tomatoes off of it. Sometimes. But if you plant 10 of those plants, are all 10 of them going to be that great tomato you like? Probably not, because again, we've got that mix of genetics in there. That's why we don't save hybrids. Okay.
On keeping seed,
Mhm.
I guess it depends on what it is, how long you can keep the seed.
Yep.
If it's gonna be viable, or some people freeze the seed.
Well, and we will talk about storage of seeds later. So if I don't fully answer, if I don't hit the topic you want, ask me again. So we'll do that so I don't get off track and repeat myself too much. So what this all comes down to, basically, whenever we're looking at seeds, is that pollination. It's the act that allows the seed to be created, but it's also where something can remain true or where we can have something go awry or new genes get introduced. So for open pollinated, the true to type, you don't want your red slicer tomato to be pollinated by a yellow, salad tomato that's also open pollinated. Because if you do that, you've just changed that genetic background. You've created more genetic diversity. And so that's going to create changes in the seed that forms from that cross pollination. So what's important to understand how we deal with this, or what this truly means for us, is understanding the primary method that the plant that we're talking about uses for pollination. So the big ones are insects, pretty explanatory. We think of bees, but there's a lot of other insects that can sometimes be involved. Wind, that's a big one for like corn, for instance, or self-pollinating. And we'll talk about more what that means. And really, self-pollinating just means it's not aided by wind or insect pollinators or anything else. So how do we prevent unwanted pollination? The simplest one is just by creating an absence of a different type of pollen that we don't want. So for instance, if we were going to be growing carrots for seed, it may make sense not to have any other carrots growing in our garden. Pretty straightforward, right? If there's only one type of carrot and it's the only thing producing carrot pollen, we're pretty safe that we're going to have a selfing flower there, and it's going to be resulting in seed we want. The challenge is sometimes that absence is more than just what we're growing. So how many are familiar with the wildflower Queen Anne's lace? Okay, Queen Anne's lace is a wild carrot. And so it is the same genus and species. And so if you have Queen Anne's lace in closer proximity to your garden, and carrots are insect pollinated, you very well could have Queen Anne's lace pollen end up on your carrot flowers. And so that means that mom was a carrot and dad was Queen Anne's lace. And so you're going to get something that's a mix. So if you've ever dug up a Queen Anne's lace plant, I'm pretty sure their roots are white. They're certainly not as large as a modern carrot, certainly not as sweet. So that's probably not the next generation of carrots you want in the garden next year. You probably want the sweet, large orange or yellow or purple or all the different rainbow colors we have on carrots now. But whatever it is, we don't probably want the wildflower, that wild carrot. And so we do have to think about, not only is it what's growing in our garden, are there wild species we may have to take concern with? Is our neighbor growing some carrots and they let them go to flower? So it's more than just what happens in our little garden area.
Are some of these, not specifically this, but some wild varieties, would it make it poisonous or just not as effective or pretty or tasty or whatever?
No, by and large, I don't think it would make it poisonous or anything like that. And off the top of my head, certainly we have some wild mustards and things like that. It would just be, it's not going to have the table quality we want. So, technically, I think you could eat a wild carrot if you want to. I just don't think you'd enjoy it a lot because it hasn't had the benefit of that selection to get the sugar content, the size that we like.
So what's the distance that there has to be?
We'll talk about that. That's an excellent question. So another way we can prevent unwanted pollination is the timing of pollination. So this works well for some crops, and other crops it's really a challenge. So for instance, indeterminate tomato keeps growing all season long until it's killed by frost or disease, or you rip it out because it overgrew the path or whatever. Because of that, it's going to keep blooming and creating blooms over a long period of time. So if you were growing an indeterminate tomato with that long bloom period, it's going to be hard to find a period of time once it starts blooming that you don't have overlap with other tomatoes. So it probably wouldn't work well for that. But for something like corn, which corn, whenever it's shedding pollen, it's called tasseling. The tassels at the top of the corn plant are releasing pollen. The ears of corn are the female flowers, and those silk are the pistils. And so they're actually getting the corn, and it's wind pollinated. So you could have a corn that has a much shorter growing period than another one, plant them at the same time, and the first one should be flowering and done shedding pollen before that second one comes into play. Now, corn is a neat one to talk about for just a second, because remember I said, you know, when we have the pollination go awry with those cucurbit crops, it's not going to make this year's squash take like a gourd. It's next year's squash whenever we grow it out. Corn is the exception, because whenever we eat corn, we're actually eating the seed. And so we are eating the change of genetics that we create through pollination. And so the reason we don't eat field corn is because it stores its sugar in a different form than sweet corn. And so if you have sweet corn that is pollinated by field corn, you're not going to have the same sugary taste. So that's why people will talk about, you know, you have to be careful if you're growing more than one type of corn, like field corn or whatever. It's because of that. It does affect this year's harvest. And it's because we're actually harvesting the seed to eat. That's what corn kernels are. It's the seed. And that is that recombined genetics of mom and dad. And if it changes the way that seed stores sugar, it changes the taste for us. And so that's kind of the one caveat of changing flavor for that current season. So again, timing can work well for some crops, not everything. It generally, the more limited bloom period it has where it blooms and it's done, the better off we are trying this one. Isolation by distance. So now this one works well. And the reason I say it works well is this is the primary method with commercial seed production. So there's actually in states, different entities that are in charge of certifying seed production. And one of the primary thing they look at is there other, crops similar to this? So other corn being grown nearby. And so depending on whether it is wind pollinated, insect pollinated, or self-pollinated, that distance can be very minimal, especially for home gardeners, or fairly significant. So self-pollinators have the shortest distance. They're the least likely to have insects moving pollen or have wind at play. Wind is probably the ones that we separate the furthest. And so this works well if you have more room on your property. This works well if you're in an area where people aren't growing vegetables. But it can be challenging if you have something that's wind pollinated and it's something that is planted quite a bit where you are living. Because depending on what we're talking about, you may want to be more than a mile away to really ensure that we don't have a cross. Again, you don't have to take it to that standard if you're a backyard gardener, but certainly at a seed production level, the distances can be quite a bit. And so this is something just to understand that distance can work better for some crops than other. And we'll talk about what some of those can be. And in the resources, there's more than one resource that talks about isolation distances that can be implemented for different crops. And we'll have some exact examples later on tonight to mention. The other thing we can do is isolation by physical means. We can do this through more than one way. So some of the easiest we can do is, use a floating row cover on our plants, just block physical access so we don't have pollinators getting to the flowers, for instance. If you've ever grown, cucurbits like yellow squash organically, or if you're wanting to avoid the use of insecticides, you can start those crops out under a floating row cover, and it's great. It keeps the insects off until you remove that cover because they start flowering, because you have to have pollination to get the fruit to grow. It's the pollination, the formation of seeds that actually allows that fruit to grow. If we don't have pollination, it just falls off. It doesn't actually grow. And so we remove those floating row covers and we get pollination happening then. You can leave that floating row cover in place, but that means you're going to have to become the pollinator. So that means, and like squash blossoms, for instance, only last for one day. So that means every morning you're going to have to go out there, you're going to have to find some male blossoms, take them, and then rub the anthers onto the female blossoms. And then ideally, you're going to close those blossoms back, staple them closed, tape them closed, put a bag over it, so you don't have an insect that shows up and decides to undo your wonderful work you just did. So it's impractical from just a gardening standpoint, unless you're trying to breed your own plant varieties, because utilizing a physical block is how a lot of plant, I would even say most, plant breeding actually happens, because it works really well. So you're doing corn, you go through, you cut off the tassels on the top of mom, because if you don't want her self-pollinating, you're trying to make a cross. So you cut off all the male flowers, those tassels. You would put actually a paper bag over the ear, because you don't want any errant pollen on the wind getting there and contaminating your cross. But what you have to do is you have to come back with, lots of times they will take male flowers, beat them in a paper bag, and then you got a bag of pollen. And so you come back and then you put that and dump it on the ear, and it's on the pistils. And so you get pollination that way. So it's a great way when you're trying to breed things. Otherwise, the labor you have involved really makes it difficult, because you've removed the pollinator method, whether it's wind or insects, from the picture, and you're doing it yourself now. And so it's impractical, I think, at scale. It may be useful if there's something particularly you're trying to keep very pure, but you're not wanting to limit yourself on what you're growing or other ways. So it can work. It does work, but it's probably impractical in the home garden. So just be aware of that. There is one caveat we can mention, and certainly in our area, this would probably not typically be a problem unless maybe we're in a very severe drought. So there are some flowers that are very strongly self-pollinating and very rarely get insect visits. So even things like pea and beans don't get a lot of insect visits. They're strongly self-pollinating. But if we're in the middle of a drought and everybody's looking for pollen and nectar, you can get flower visits that you might not ordinarily. So just be aware of that. When we have unusual circumstances, it can make sometimes this a little bit more difficult. But again, typically, if something is strongly self-pollinating, it's strongly self-pollinating, and there's not going to be a high likelihood that anything's going to change about that. Another way we can reduce cross-pollination is planting in blocks rather than rows. So we kind of have that depicted there on the screen. And that center area, the red part, is where we would actually harvest seed from. And the thinking is on this, those outer rows act as a buffer. So whether it's wind moving pollen or insects flying in pollen from a different variety, you hope that when they visit those outside flowers in your planting, those are the ones that get the cross-pollination, and the ones on the interior receive the pollen from the ones around them. It's not foolproof, but even with commercial seed production, oftentimes they will use this strategy and have buffers, particularly on like a wind pollinated crop like corn, and on the prevailing wind side, they may have a buffer of multiple rows that they do not actually harvest for seed production. Again, it's just to avoid the chance of errant pollen resulting in a cross that was not desired. The other thing we can do to try to limit this, and both of these are good if we don't want to go to some of the more exaggerated methods, we can harvest seed from fruit that is formed during the peak bloom period. So, most flowers and most things in the garden, they kind of start off slower, then they reach a peak, and then they kind of slow back down again. It's kind of like a bell curve, probably not perfectly, but close enough. And so if we don't harvest the earliest or the latest, we're actually harvesting in the middle of fruit production. In theory, that's when the flowers were most abundant that we wanted to have pollen from, because that's when that variety was at peak flower production, was however many weeks earlier before the fruit was ripe. So we can kind of harvest in the middle period. And that is, again, a way to hopefully say, okay, the most correct pollen was available and abundant during that period. So these should be most likely to be pollinated by that pollen. And so again, just looking at the peak of your fruit maturity or harvest might be a good time to actually save the seed. And again, sometimes people say, well, I want to save the earliest seed possible, and maybe that will make the plants bloom earlier. A lot of that has to do with that environmental factor. We see a lot of things this year blooming early in the landscape. That doesn't mean that the seed that we save from those flowers is going to bloom any earlier than the standard plant does, because a lot of it is highly influenced by environmental factors. So just be aware of that. Again, if we harvest during that main period, we should be getting the pollination we want to happen to actually happen. So what are the easiest vegetables for beginners to start seed saving with? There's 4 good ones for seed savers: peas, beans, tomatoes, and lettuce. So the good thing is, I don't think any of these are that exotic in the home garden. A lot of people grow these. We've got the earliest crops like peas and lettuces are both ones we can already be putting out now. And we could have been putting out peas for probably a little while, depending how much work we wanted to put into it. Some folks will actually pre-spout peas and put them out about the middle of February. And a lot of years that works very well. But what these 4 crops all have in common, they're all strongly self-pollinators. And again, so that means we're not looking at insects. We're not looking at wind moving that pollen. As a result, they all have very short isolation distances. So if you want to grow a couple or 3 different bean varieties and save seed and still hopefully ensure everything is true to type, it's much more easily accomplished in the home garden. The other thing is, these are all annuals. It's not complicated by having to grow a plant, store a root, and then replant it, or grow a plant, let it overwinter, and then get flowers the next season. All of these are very easily grown in small areas, especially if we're utilizing things like staking and trellising, staking for tomatoes, trellising for peas and beans. We can grow vertically, so it doesn't take a huge amount of space. And certainly these are all suitable to our garden environment. They work for our area. We still, again, ideally want to take some precautions to ensure purity, but some of this goes back to the having fun part. So if you just want to see, hey, can I save seed and regrow it next year? Don't get too concerned about the purity aspect of it, because it's not a big deal to you. On the other hand, if you have great grandma's tomato, you're probably going to be heartbroken if suddenly next year it shows up and it's yellow instead of red. So in that case, you probably do want to take the effort for those precautions. So a lot of this just depends, what is your go out of seed saving? If you just want to have viable seed, so you don't have to go to the store and buy it, you may not be very concerned at all. But again, these 4, it's pretty easy to have very strong assurances that everything should be okay. And so we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. I thought I'd also mention some flowers that are great for beginner seed savers, so we don't leave those out of the discussion tonight entirely. Things like marigolds, zinnias, morning glory, cleome or spider plant, nasturtium, poppies, snapdragons, and sunflowers. And there are others. This is not an exhaustive list, nor is the 4 vegetables an exhaustive list, only the ones you should try early on. There is a good publication that we have from the University of Tennessee. It's Seed-Grown Flowers for the Garden. If you look through it, it's not necessarily going to tell you this plant is easy to save seed from. But if you notice in the comments, there's a big chart to it. if you look for self-sowers or plants that reseed or reseeders, those are going to be plants that are going to be pretty easy generally to save seed from. So self-sowing plants, reseeding plants are generally also easy to save seed from. So let's look at some specifics on those easy vegetables. Pea plants. So what we're looking at, a minimum isolation distance of 10 feet between different varieties. Well, that's not much at all. And it's because these are very, very strongly self-pollinating. Minimum population size. So I'm going to contradict some of what I said earlier. Remember, I said that these are kind of inbred populations and they don't have as broad of a genetic base as others. That's true, but there is still some genetic variability within that population. And because of that, we want to preserve it. And so what I mean by that is if you just save seed pods off of one pea plant, you have saved plants from one mother. That's really narrowing the genetic basis versus if you had seed pods off of 10 to 20 plants, because then you have 10 to 20 different mothers that could have slight variable differences. Again, not dramatic. They do look very similar, but we don't want to narrow that genetic basis to where we only have one mother plant in all of our seed background. So having a population of 10 to 20 plants, saving some seed from all of those would give us a pretty good assurance that we're still going to maintain the variability within that entire population. Again, it's not as much as we see in some plant populations, but they're not clones either. So it's not they're all identical copies. So it is good to have some minimum population size because we don't want to necessarily select out for what happens is you could by mistake, by selecting just from one plant or one or two plants, you could remove a characteristic that was important. So if it's disease resistance and suddenly your plants that never got disease are getting hammered all the time, that could happen because you selected out on just a couple of mother plants and for whatever reason, those two plants did not carry that genetic resource for disease resistance. And consequently, now you've got plants that are highly susceptible to disease. So there can be some real consequences by shrinking that genetic variability. Again, it's not going to be something that's highly visible, but it is something to keep in the back of our minds because we don't want to bottleneck those genetics. Beans, and what's important with beans is we have more than one type of bean that we could be growing in our garden. So Phaseolus vulgaris, this is the common garden bean. So this is our green beans, most of our soup beans and things like that. Minimum isolation distance, again, 10 feet. Keep in mind, peas and beans are cousins to each other. They're in the same larger family, plant family. So, it's not odd that they might share some characteristics. Again, small minimum population size, 10 to 20 plants. That doesn't mean you have to save every pod off of those 10 plants or every pod off of those 20 plants, but save some off of a range of plants. So again, we want to ensure that diversity. Now we start getting a little more complicated when we look at other beans in the garden that are not this genus and species. So runner beans, not as commonly grown, but certainly some people may be growing those from time to time. They have a significantly larger isolation distance of 800 feet. So you're probably not going to have 10 different varieties of runner beans planted around your house unless you've got some acreage there. Again, with them, you're also wanting to have a larger number of, or a larger minimum population size. So a number of plants that you're saving seed from. Lima beans, again, not the same species, but same genus as our green beans or common bean. On 40 feet, so not as dramatic as runner beans. It is not impossible, but highly unlikely that we would ever get crossing from these different species to one another. So what I mean is you could grow a vulgaris, the coccinius or the lunatus, one after the other or one right beside the other, And there's almost a guarantee that there would never be any cross-pollination between the three because they are different species. It's theoretically possible that one of them might pollinate one of the others because of genetics and haploid numbers and stuff, but it's almost never going to happen. So don't be, that's one way. If you do want different beans in your garden, grow these different types if you're very limited on space. But again, common beans, we're talking about 10 feet. So certainly that's even for most small gardens, easily accomplished. It may mean you have some of these on a trellis in the front flower bed. You have some in a small backyard, raised bed garden, for instance, but certainly you can find some ways to get that 10 feet easily. Another thing to mention, cowpeas or asparagus beans, they're not beans at all. So they have different requirements, but the thing about them, although sometimes asparagus bean, we think, oh, it's another bean. So do I have to keep this away from my white half runners? Don't have to worry about it. It's completely different genus and species. Even though we're calling them a bean, they're actually different. So that's a good thing for us. Again, another bit of diversity we can include and not worry about any sort of isolation distances.
Is that 40 at the end?
That'd be 40 population. Yep. Yep. Lettuce. Again, this is a fairly limited isolation distance. It does have a wild progenitor or a wild species it can cross with. So there are wild lettuces across the US, different species out there. But again, it's 10 feet. So you only have to make sure that you don't have a wild lettuce growing within 10 feet of your flowering lettuces in your garden. Now, the challenge is, do you know what wild lettuce looks like? That's what we have on the screen there. So that little plant that kind of looks like a tall dandelion, the leaf is kind of got teeth to it. It can be a little spiny sort of along the stem. It's going to have a white milky sap. That's wild lettuce. And so if you see yellow flowers within 10 feet of your lettuce you're trying to grow in the garden, and it looks like it has dandelion sort of like leaves, that's probably wild lettuce. So I'd get rid of it. But again, we're talking about 10 feet. This isn't where you have to, have an agreement with your neighbors where you can go through their yards or their pastures and eradicate wild lettuce. It's not that dramatic, luckily. But if we could have a wild lettuce plant pop up in the garden, and certainly if you're saving lettuce seed, you'd want to remove that. Tomatoes. Tomatoes have a little bit of complexity depending on exactly which tomatoes we're talking about. It comes down to what sort of flowers they have. So I know this is a ton of words on the screen, but basically it all comes down to the style. And the stigma that's attached to the style. Again, the female parts. So the stigma is what receives that pollen. It's the sticky part that the pollen lands on, or the pollen comes in contact with when the insect is there. And so basically we have some that stick that out of the flower and some that don't. So exserted, meaning that it sticks out of the anther cone, and we'll have some pictures that probably put this into perspective more than the words do. So on the left is a non-extended style. So where's the female part on that flower? Well, it's in there, but we don't actually see it on the screen. And so when we don't see that stigma, that tells us, okay, that's a non-extended style, because that's a mature flower, it's open, but we actually don't see it because the style is in there. And so what that means, the anthers that are in there with those female parts are going to be the ones that actually pollinate it. So this is a highly strongly self-pollinating tomato on the left. On the right, however, we do see the stigma or the style sticking out there. Let me see if I can bring up my pointer. So right here, see those kind of green dots? That's actually the stigma. And so that right there is open to, if we were to have an insect land there or something like that, that right there could be a problem for maintaining limited pollination. So this extended style, and again, the big difference is there's nothing sticking out the end of this. It's just yellow. We don't see anybody at home. On this one, we see it extended. So this one is of larger concern of cross-pollination, because it's more open to it physically. So because of that, insects could pollinate it. So if we have the non-extended style, we don't see it. We're only talking about 10 feet isolation. Minimum population 10 to 20, again, not a huge number. If we're talking about extended styles, and typically the extended styles are more likely to be seen on true heirloom types. So older varieties, potato leaf varieties, things like that are more likely to have an extended style. With those, we actually increase that minimum isolation distance to 40 feet. And again, this is to be extra cautious. If you don't care if your Cherokee purple crosses with your Kellogg's orange, plant them next door to each other. It's not going to harm the plants. It's not going to harm your tomato production. It's just going to mean that the seed in those tomatoes might, and it's always a might, be a cross pollination. So you may get something really cool and groovy out of it, or you may get a lousy tomato. But that's the only risk you're doing. So again, this all comes down to how serious do you want to do this? If it's great grandma's tomato, I'm probably going to be pretty serious about it. If it's just some tomato seeds I want to save so I don't have to keep buying them year after year, you can probably have a higher threshold there and less worry.
The groovy tomato, the son,
Yes.
he plants him, I love it. Can I continue growing it, or is he like sterile the next?
Nope. So that F1, so we had those two tomatoes cross, you save the seed from the crossed fruit, those seed, plant them out, and you like what you see. You can keep growing it. The challenge is that tomato, those seeds you plant are technically hybrids. So there's a lot of genetic variability. So really it would take you to stabilize that one that resulted that was great. It's going to take some time to really stabilize that because it's got a mix of genetics in there. If you plant out 100 of those seeds from that tomato, may not be 100 in there, but let's say you did, all of them are not going to look like that one you liked. And so that's what breeders do. They cross and then they just keep selecting from generation to generation to get that line that is stable. And really we're saying you're looking for that inbreeding so you can remove those characteristics you don't want. When inbreeding works, we call it line breeding, when it doesn't, it's inbreeding. But so inbreeding is bad because it reinforces negative characteristics. It can also reinforce positive characteristics. And essentially, when you have self-pollination, it's technically inbreeding, but it's only good options available to it. So they keep repeatedly being good for us. So again, how serious you do this comes down to how important is that purity of a particular variety. So I mentioned this earlier about physiological maturity. We want to allow growth to keep happening to those fruits. And again, with fruits, I'm talking about where the seed are at. So I know on lettuce seed, like you see depicted there on the right, we don't think of there being a fruit there like we do with the tomato on the left. But in fact, technically there is because there's seed. And so a tomato that is ideally ripe for seed saving, it's going to be overripe for most purposes. So it's going to be a tomato that's very soft. And that's when we want to remove it from the plant. So we don't have to wait till they fall off or rot off or anything like that. But we want it to be fully colored, whatever the color is. And if you're not aware of it, we have white tomatoes and green tomatoes and striped tomatoes and purple tomatoes and so on. So make sure it's the true, so there are some tomatoes that are honestly green when they're ripe. So just make sure it's fully ripe. And generally one of the ways we can tell when tomatoes are getting very ripe, they start to soften. Because if we're harvesting for sales, we don't let them get that soft because soft tomatoes do not travel well at all. They like to turn into salsa in a box. So just be aware of that. And again, by a culinary standard, we would say those tomatoes were overripe. And so just be aware again, as long as we can allow them to physically mature, we need the full maturity. And so when we see lettuce seed like that, where it's starting to get the little fluffies on it, we know that seed is done. It is fully mature. And so we need to look at collecting that and harvesting it. With peas and beans, we'll start to see like on the left, you'll notice that's no longer a very green pod, which oddly enough, just useless horticulture knowledge, a legume is in reference to the pod or the fruit of the plant. So sometimes people hear legume and they think nitrogen fixer. And yes, most legumes will fix nitrogen, but not every legume fixes nitrogen. And a legume literally applies to as reference to the fruit, which is a pod, which we see on, as an example, peas and beans. That's like red buds. If you've ever noticed the fruit pods on it, very sort of bee or peen like. Oh, wait, what did I say there? Let's correct that. A pea or bean. There we go. Put the N on the right one that time. And it looks very similar. It's because it is a legume plant. So when we start seeing that go from green to that yellow, that right there actually is looking, if you're looking for a shelling bean for actually cooking, if you've never cooked fresh like pinto beans that haven't dried down yet, encourage you to give it a shot. They have great flavor. They don't take as long to cook. And so there's nothing wrong with eating those. And that's really starting to get close. What's good about seed saving is we can wait until they're very mature. So in ideal circumstances, we can let them just continue drying down on the plant to where you see on the right, very dramatic color change. The pod has shrunk around the seeds inside. The problem is sometimes if we have a lot of wet weather, it's hard for those to dry out. We start getting mold and things. So you will often see recommendations for pulling up bean plants whenever you start getting the fully mature pods on there, so you can put them somewhere out of the weather and they can actually dry. So just be aware of that.
Do they mature once you take them off? Like if I took off a green one, left it off to the side, they'll turn brown. No, those.
Great question. So no, so those fruit are not going to be maturing truly after you remove them from the plant. So if they were starting to turn yellow and you pulled them off the plant, those beans or peas inside could dry down and you probably wouldn't notice any negative effects because basically they had reached maturity. So you don't, but if you pull off an immature green bean, it's not going to mature because there's no more energy coming into that green bean, and it takes energy because basically, you know, seeds are energy storage units with a little embryo, because when they germinate, all the energy at first is coming from the seed, not from photosynthesis. So it's got to start getting established before it ever starts photosynthesizing itself. So it's a big storage unit. And so if you've ever grown any number of different green beans, for instance, some varieties you have to harvest while that bean inside is very immature. If you don't, that pod gets very leathery and tough, and no amount of cooking makes it worth anything. And it's all about, and if you do that, you have a larger bean at that point physically because you've had more energy going into it. So no, you won't get to physiological maturity off the plant. You can let things dry down off a plant if it's already mature, but you're not going to increase the maturity off of the plant. Not a bad question at all. Lettuce is one that's not difficult to harvest the seed from overall, because basically as you see those heads start to mature, you are going to take a paper bag and either over multiple days or even cut the head off. You're just going to stick it in a bag and just knock it around in there. And those seeds are going to fall off. Lettuce seeds are wind dispersed. That's why they got all the fluff on them. They're wanting to fly around. So they're not hard to dislodge from a plant whenever they are mature. And then once you have that collected, all those fluffy seed, you can rub them between your hands. You can use a sieve, rub them over the wire screen of that to further help clean that seed. All seed, we want to make sure it's fully dry before storage, and we're getting to storage. And so we don't want to be putting these like in direct sun or in a car in the middle of summer to really cook down or anything like that. But a warm place isn't bad. Good airflow is good. Some things like lettuce seed, we might be able to keep in a bag, but we want to make sure there's not clumping in there, that they're not staying wet. So we're shaking the bag daily, making sure things are drying evenly. So a lot of things do great just drying them out in the open on a table, whether it's on screens or paper towels or things like that. Beans, obviously, as they begin to dry down, go ahead. You can harvest individual pods. You can rip up the entire plant. We can easily, a lot of beans, especially if they're very dry, they're easy to shell out to get the beans out of it. Not difficult at all. Those pods break apart. You can also throw them in a pillowcase, throw them in a dryer on a no heat setting with some tennis balls in there, allow it to beat the beans apart for you. You can step on them, walk on them to break apart those pods. Beans are pretty tough. We wouldn't want to jump up and down on the beans or anything like that, but certainly we can break them apart with mechanical means as long as we're within reason. Again, let them dry down fully. Certainly, again, sometimes we have them in a bag, make sure we don't have any clumping and things are drying evenly. Now, tomatoes. A lot of people are familiar with how you can save tomatoes. You scoop out the seeds, put them in a container, add water to cover those seeds. And then after about 48 hours or so, we come back. And basically what we're doing is we are fermenting those seeds. And the reason we're doing is there's a little gel sac around those seeds. And by having them in this soup of tomato stuff and water, we'll have some fungi and other things going on that are going to break down that gel sac. And so we can stir it while we're waiting for that to happen. Once it's finished fermenting, it's not bubbling anymore or anything like that. We add more water, stir it again. We allow the seeds to settle to the bottom and then pour off everything else that's in there. Do that several times. And basically what you end up with are some pretty clean seeds. It's not difficult. We put them out on things like wax paper to dry. Paper towels are not, because they can stick to the paper towels, and that can be a little problematic if you're wanting very clean, easily removed seeds. Now you'll notice I have a very small a question down there at the bottom, but is fermentation required? The answer is no. So this is something I've done many times myself. It's the lazy method and it works great. So rather than ferment them, I don't care if they end up with a gel sac on them or not, because it's actually not going to interfere with them germinating later. So what I will do is I'll just scoop the seeds out, throw them on a paper towel, put them on a paper plate, just let them dry down. And when they're done drying, you're done. Now, the challenge with this, and what's good is I found somebody else on the internet that's doing that, so I know I'm right. No, this does work. I've done it multiple years. The challenge with this is that your seed aren't pretty. So you don't get nice, white, pretty tomato seeds like you do with the fermentation method. So if you're really wanting to share these around to people, it may not be your primary method, but if you're just saving them for yourself, what I like to do is you put them on like a paper towel. You can use a Sharpie to write on the paper towel what they are. You roll it up when they're totally dry and then throw it in the freezer. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But it's simple, it's easy, it does work. If you want to ferment and you want to have very nice, clean seeds, go with the fermenting method. Nothing wrong with it at all. And I mean, that's the way commercially it's done even, but there is a shortcut that is valid and workable. So storage of seeds after they've dried down, and we do want to make sure seeds are dried down. With large seeds, like, if we were saving gourd seeds, for instance, it's pretty easy to know when they're dried down. We could take them and snap them. They're big, or cantaloupe seeds, something like that. A lot of seeds, they're so small. I always tell people, if you think it's dry, give it 3 or 4 more days and then they'll be dry. And because they're small little things, it's not easy to snap them. I mean, sure, we could buy a moisture tester, but if I'm going to do that, I'm just going to buy seeds, So I'm trying to be cheap here. That's the whole point of this. But so basically, when you think they're done, give them a few more days and you're probably safe. The reason is we don't want to put seeds into a freezer that still have water in them, because what happens when water freezes, it expands. So if we have water or too much water in those seeds, we can basically kill them, because seeds are actually alive. And sometimes people are surprised to know that seeds are actually respiring. And that's a fancy word for saying burning energy. So remember I said seeds are an energy storage unit or device. Well, when they're sitting there, especially when we have them at warmer temperatures, they are burning through their storage reserves. And if you wait too long to plant them, they don't have enough energy to germinate and grow. So that's why we always suggest putting leftover seed into a freezer or refrigerator if you don't have a freezer, you don't have room. But the cooler you keep them, the slower they respire, or the less energy they're going to burn through. And so keep in mind that, all these storage, long-term storage things for germplasm, whether it's USDA with their storage, or like, what's the one in Norway? I can't think of the name right now, but they're storing their seeds in liquid nitrogen. We're not going to get that cold in our freezer, but it's still a good step forward to put them in the freezer. Now, this is the honest truth. With some things, you can have them in there for 10 years and they'll still do fine. I know for a fact, the other year, my mom was growing Golden Jubilee tomato. And she was saying, I need to get some more seeds. And she was looking at that seed packet that she started her transplants from, and it was from 10 years prior.
Yeah.
And it's just, she would use, however, again, she wasn't planting the whole packet. So whatever she didn't use, she would just put back in the freezer each year. And they lasted for 10 years and she had fine germination. Now, there are some seeds that do not have that lifespan. I think in some of the resources, and I don't know that I've pulled it out specifically, but certainly it's not hard to find lifespans of seeds and storage. Onion is one that is not great. Parsnips is one that is not great. Those two are jumping to my mind. There may be some others that are shorter lived or shorter lived, but a lot of these seeds, once they dry down, if we put them into cold storage, they're going to last literally for years with not much loss in germination.
How about greens, different types of greens, kale, collards?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to look that one up.
Okay.
But, and that's it. What's great about this is, okay, let's say we save seeds and it's starting to get a little long. What happens is basically not all those seeds will germinate. You lose some of them. Your germination percentage go down. If you look on seed packets, very often you will see where they have a germination testing date and percentage on there. Well, 9 times out of 10, people plant 2 or 3 seeds and all of them pop up, right? Because especially with fresh seed, the reality is if you fear lower germination, just plant more seeds into each hole or into each, cell pack tray or whatever you're doing. Just put more in there, because if you had a 30% germination rate, if you put in 3 on average, you'd pretty much average out to where you would have 1 plant per cell or per planting. So, it's not that seeds as they start getting older, or if we leave them out of a freezer, that they're not usable. It's just that we start losing them. Their germination rate's going to go down. So to offset that, we can increase how much seeding we're actually putting in place.
Do some of these seeds need to be in the freezer to pretend like it's winter so that they can be planted?
So,
that I heard a long time ago.
No, that's actually an excellent question. So are we putting these seeds in the freezer or the fridge to mimic like they're going through winter out of doors? Not in the case of these seeds, and not for most of our domesticated stuff. However, for wild plants, so a lot of our wildflowers or trees and shrubs, we can certainly reproduce them from seed, but they need to go through a cold wet period called stratification. Stratification comes from nursery men and women used to layer seeds and then a layer of wet sand and then a layer of seeds and a layer of wet sand. So you got strata or layers. And so the term became stratification for putting seeds in cold wet conditions. And the reason you did that was so you would be able to have germination. And basically you were faking the seed out. You were saying, hey, you went through winter, now you need to grow. What we've done in the vegetable world and for many of our annual plants that we grow, we have selected that out of them. So how many people have ever cut open a tomato and had sprouted seeds inside of it?
Yeah.
Things like that happen. How many of you have ever grown beans or peas, earlier in the season, and you had some that stayed on the vine, bust open, and then later you see little plants growing? We've actually selected our plants to where all the seeds germinate immediately, which is great. Whenever we go and plant 100 seeds, we get 100 popping out of the ground. The bad thing is sometimes we can have them popping up whenever we don't want them to. So For the vegetables and flowers we ordinarily save, no, we don't have to go through that cold wet period. For a lot of native stuff that we may be reproducing, yes, it does need that. And yes, you are faking it out, making it think, hey, we just went through winter. So excellent question. So what I like to do when I have seeds and I'm putting them in the freezer, I like putting them in either a glass or plastic jar. Doesn't matter. The reason I like that, I mean, you could put them in a box. It doesn't matter. But what I like about the glass and plastic jar, I can bring that out, put it on the counter, let it warm up to room temperature, and then open it. And I'm not worried about condensation getting inside of it that way. So I'll have the seeds themselves in, it doesn't matter whether you're in plastic baggies or paper envelopes, no difference. Either one's fine. And then just allow that larger container to reach room temperature before you open it up. If you open it up, pull something out and throw it back in, where you open it up to the warmer air, it goes in there, it cools off. You could have water condensing inside that container. It's probably going to be minimal, but at least this way I can let it come up to room temperature, and then so I don't have condensation forming on the inside. And I'm not got that little bit of chance that I'm re-wetting my seeds I'm putting in the freezer. Because obviously if we wet seeds, they start swelling. The technical term when they start taking up water is imbibition. Fun word to say. So think of imbibing a liquid, same exact root. And so that imbibition is that uptake of water at the beginning of germination. I don't want those seeds to start uptaking water and then freeze again because I'm afraid it will damage them. Yes, ma'am.
Got a question. I have saved seeds and saved them in old medicine bottle. I had heard that the darker color would help the seeds last longer. Is there any truth to it?
So
And
would,
I have
okay.
2 or 3 different types of tomatoes in one seed bottle. Would that hurt?
Okay, so I'll take the second question first. It doesn't matter if you have multiple kinds of seed in one container and they're all in there together. I know of no interaction or no concern where one is going to produce ethylene and harm the others or anything like that. I don't think we have any concerns about having different types of seeds together. The second question, well, what about if you have different colored containers? Does the color of a container matter? If I'm putting them in a fridge or freezer, I'm going to say absolutely not, because they're not really getting exposed to light at all. The few times the light comes on whenever I'm in there, I don't think it matters enough to worry about. Those different colors can have an impact if we were to have things out and maybe it's getting impacted by sunlight. Different colors of glass or plastic might have some role to play, but I don't think in the way we typically store seeds that would have any play to worry about. Because again, I just got them in the fridge or freezer and it's mostly, ambient light, so I don't think that's a concern I would have one way or the other. I don't think there's any harm in it, but I don't think it's really beneficial. A super big seed saving tip, if this slide doesn't tip you off, label everything. So label the containers. Whenever they go into your larger container, label the transplants. When you're growing those, label the rows in the garden, label. You won't remember which one was which, even though you'll remember, because you won't. We're all human. If you do, you're the rarity. And then this just prevents you from having those, I don't know, but I really like this bean. It happens and there's nothing wrong with it. You can keep growing it. But it's one of those things where the more you label, the more likely you are to keep track of it. Again, this may or may not be important to you personally. If it is, follow it. So you're going to get an email from me that includes a bunch of resources, a really good one. And it is written maybe a little more for a farmer in mind than just a backyard gardener. But the information is spot on no matter your exact capacity. This guide right here from the Organic Seed Alliance, very good. I don't care if you're wearing a Roundup hat. This is still going to be great for seed saving. So don't let the organic label throw you off at all. Even if you're not an organic producer yourself, no worries about that. It's still great information. There's also other things on there that are less complete. So some charts and things on that list. You can get that from this QR code on the screen right now, going to that website. or just wait till I send it to you on an email, and then you can go to the list of resources. So all of them are going to work to get you there. But certainly, I think if you're interested in reading more about this and understanding more about it, I think you'll find some good links on there that you will like looking through. So a few other tips. One thing I would encourage you highly, if you do have something that's very rare or sentimental to you, don't plant all the seed you have in one season, because that's going to be the time the groundhog gets into the garden, or we get the hailstorm or a flood or whatever. Because, you know, if you do have that something that is completely irreplaceable, we don't want to lose that. And so don't plant every seed you have in any one season. That way, if the worst happens, there's always next year. So just keep that in mind. The other thing to consider, and it is roguing of off type. So what's roguing means just selecting out and basically ripping plants out, throwing them away. So again, if you are saving seed for a red slicer tomato and you end up with a yellow salad tomato coming up, I would get rid of it if I was planning, if my goal was saving red slicer seed, because clearly that yellow tomato is never going to turn into a red slicer. And so it was probably some cross-pollination happened, but it's off type. It's not what you're looking for. Now, the other option you can do rather than getting rid of the plant is, you know, select it out and try to develop it, because now you've got that yellow salad tomato that's also got a red slicer background in its parentage. That may be unique, different, and good in some way. So it's whatever you want to do. But if my goal was to save red slicer seed, and I don't care about, you know, playing with that other one, I'm going to rogue it out. I'm going to get rid of it. So looking at, is this plant looking like what it's supposed to be? Is it bearing what it's supposed to bear? Does it taste like what it's supposed to bear? You know, thinking about those sorts of things can be important. Do keep in mind, there is that environmental factor. But if you have a plant that is suddenly very dramatically different, chances are it probably could be the result of pollination that you weren't intending to happen. And again, if you're very serious about preserving a particular variety, do think about keeping multiple years of seed in reserve, because when you do start seeing an off type pop up, especially if it's more than just one plant, then that means at an earlier period, something went wrong. So the further back in its genetic lineage you can go, the better off you are for restarting those lines. Again, only important if you're very serious about purity and preserving something, but just something to keep in mind. So with that, I'm going to pause for questions and take a drink.